Where do you want? I'm guessing at the end of our talk, I'll sit down. And then we'll. No, I sit on my own. Perfect. Yeah, okay. 30 minutes. And then.
Good morning. Thanks for being here on a brisk and subway impaired day. This is the last day of our Mapping Injustice conference. I'm Jackie Reich, one of the co-organizers with Gregory Donovan, if you haven't met us. Today we are really excited to have our second featured project, and I'd like to introduce my colleague, who is Professor of Art History at Fordham, Barbara Mundy. Great. Thank you. I'm gonna leave here. All right. Thank you all for coming out on this brisk Saturday morning for an exciting closing day of this wonderful conference. It's my real pleasure to introduce today Alex Heel. For those of you who, for those of all of us in the New York digital humanities world, Alex Heel needs very little introduction, as he's well known to us as a member of the steering committee of HAYSTACK, which is Humanities, Arts, Science, and Technology Alliance Collaboratory. And he's also a digital scholarship librarian at the Columbia University Libraries. When I first met Alex about 10 years ago, his handle was colibri. I don't know if it still is. That's the diminutive but fierce hummingbird of the tropics. It's a good handle for an alter ego for Alex. The hummingbird's iridescent plumage can change from vivid green to dark blue to deep violet in a matter of seconds. Now, not only is Alex a pretty serious geek, he started programming on a Commodore 64, but he's also a scholar of amazing range and diversity, like the colibri's plumage. This is evident in his work on the Martinique poet Aimé Césaire, and Alex is creating a geobibliography of this founder of negritude. He's also at work on a project called The Same Boats, which is a visualization of the transatlantic intersections of Black intellectuals in the 20th century. And he's also an editor, again, The Changing Plumage of Alex, Our Colibri, with the Small Axe Project, which is dedicated to Caribbeanist intellectual and artistic work. Now, we know our colibri for their plumage, but they're also notable for their qualities as fierce warriors. And Alex has been a fighter for social justice. In all of his works, he's very attentive to addressing the digital divide that exists between the United States and other third world and Caribbean countries. He's most recently been one of the engineers of the 2017 Mapathon, which took place after Hurricane Maria desiccated Puerto Rico. This has led him to help envision something that he's designing called the Nimble Toolkit, which lays the foundation for how to address the threats and disasters as a community. He'll be talking to us today about yet another social justice project called Torn Apart, Separados, which visualizes the geography of Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Alex Heel.
That has to be my favorite introduction so far. You brought the hummingbird. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming on a very snippy morning on a Saturday. I'm going to be talking for 30 minutes about the project Torn Apart, Separados, which I'm about to walk you through. How many of you have seen it? Okay, good. I'm going to say about half. So I'm going to do this in 3 movements. I'm going to spend some time in the beginning just walking you through it for those of you who have not seen it. Then in the second movement, I'm going to ask us to reflect on what is it? What kind of object is it within the academy or outside the academy? And then finally, I want to propose that we think together about the sort of labor that is involved in this and how we can go forward in these kind of interdisciplinary spaces and the kinds of interdisciplinary spaces that we can create when we're not at conferences. And that should be it, a simple 3-part movement for 30 minutes. And I'm going to start my clock. I should have started already. Take a minute penalty there. But. All right. So last summer, Father's Day, I am, like you, observing the video of little kids asking for their parents circulate on social media. There's a particular harrowing image of a little girl that says, "Where's mommy? Where's mommy? Where's mommy?" And everybody that I saw on social media, conservative or liberal or progressive, was devastated by these images. I think most of the nation came together to understand this as cruelty, as a tragedy. And so I'm talking to my colleague Manan Ahmed, one of the founders of the Group for Experimental Methods in the Humanities, which is our research cluster at Columbia University where we do these kinds of hummingbird-like activities. And we asked each other, are we going to do something? Now, just a couple of weeks before, I had the same conversation with Rupika Risam, one of the digital humanists that I have collaborated with over the years, after we learned that 1,500 kids were unaccounted for. And those 2 weeks prior, we decided not to do anything about that because we realized that perhaps they didn't want to be found. But in this case, when Manan, Ahmed, and me were talking, we did decide that it was important to do something. Because that's something in this case would not be about uncovering the hidden location of children that did not want to be found, but uncovering the infrastructure that actually was making these kids disappear in the first place. We felt that the United States did not have a good sense of the extent of the ICE police force. We felt that people were operating under the mistaken sense that the border is just this strip that separates the US and Mexico sovereign claims, and we got to work. The first thing we did was put together a team of 7 people, some experts on migration issues, experts on US-Mexico border issues, and the other veterans of digital humanities who, like us, have been doing work in social justice. In 6.5 days, after dropping everything we were doing, we produced the first volume of Torn Apart, Separados. This is what viewers saw when they came to the site for the first time, probably prompted by the article on Wired that I had while I gave my opening remarks, that pointed people to the map. We had been working with Emily Dreyfus at Wired halfway through the week to get the article done at the same time that we were doing the project, because we understood that the mainstream press could actually get our work in the eyes of Americans much better than we can as academics. The headline read, "ICE is everywhere." And this is more or less what the map of ICE infrastructure in the United States kind of reveals. That in every state, there is an ICE presence. Now, this is the iconic image. There are many more images, and I'm going to walk you through some of the most important ones. The big dots in orange represent ICE facilities that have an active daily population. So this is, for example, Stewart Detention Center in Georgia that has an average daily population of about 1,500 immigrants incarcerated. The little dots represent detention facilities that ICE has access to if it wanted to use them. So these are county jails and things like this. Now, of course, we wanted to represent them too because this wasn't just about the existing infrastructure, but about the potential infrastructure for incarceration. Many of us have already studied pre-World War II Germany enough to understand that knowledge of the existing infrastructure before the war would have helped perhaps prevent some of the worst tragedies of the 20th century. Because as we know, the Nazis were operating secretly through many different tricks of the trade. In blue, you find the private juvenile detention facilities. This is where we suspect that the children were being held, that were being separated from the families at this time. Now, the difference between a pop-up window for the orange dots and the blue dots is that the blue dots don't actually give you much extra information. And this is us trying to make it a little harder for people to go protest at these facilities. This was an ethical decision that we made in the team because we're already hearing reports that the kids were afraid of protesters outside. They're already under enormous stress and under the threat and practice of state violence. We felt we didn't want to ask that risk. Of course, perhaps today the decision would have been different, but this was an ethical decision we made at the time. Now, each volume of Torn Apart, and this is what made it a unique object, came with a series of visualizations. That wasn't the only one. The eye, for example, allows you to visit some of these facilities as they look. This is where a lot of the feedback actually consisted of people telling us, I didn't know that in my neighborhood this building was being used to house immigrants. You will find these centers in remote rural areas, but also right next to beauty salons in the Bronx. Even though none of us are sociologists or trained economists, most of us are actually trained in history or English, we felt that it was important to actually do some number crunching. So we presented this kind of information that allows you to see the big picture of incarceration. This is the current average daily population as of 2018. It's probably different now, of immigrants in this country. It's 45,000 more or less immigrants that are being held in detention in this country every day on average. One of the most distinctive visualizations in this volume is the one where we try to map only the Office of Refugee and Resettlement infrastructure, where the kids are being held right after they are separated from their families. Now, what makes this one distinctive is that this is, in a sense, an accurate representation, but it eludes you. It does communicate the size and more or less the region in which these things are happening, but every time you try to click on one of these buttons, it will move away from your attempt to click on it. Now, this is where the Humanities comes in, right? There are two main reasons why we did this. One I already mentioned, which is we didn't feel that it was prudent of us to actually share very precise information of where the children were. We knew in most cases exactly where they were. The other is that they actually were being moved around very rapidly to, as immigration lawyers reported, to confuse immigration lawyers and make it harder for them to actually work on behalf of these kids. Each volume, and I'll eventually reach, I'll reach very quick volume 2, is accompanied by a self-reflection where we elaborate on our method of research as we do this but also where we are honest about our own shortcomings and warn readers about the dangers of visualizations and perhaps give them some tips on how not to read these maps. This is also where we were able to also add things that couldn't make it into the final project, into the final set of visualizations. Like, for example, part of our research involved going into the paraphernalia and why and gray literature of corporations. I'll show you that in a second. Another took us into Facebook and Google Maps, where families were asking for their family members on these kind of innocuous apps. Here's an example of a mother asking for her daughter on the address that pops up on Google Maps for this incarceration center. We saw that this was happening too on the Facebook pages. That actually was tweeted out like 3 days into the project, and it was picked up by a reporter, this kind of aspect of the story, and was picked up by a reporter as late. And I welcome you to go and read what was happening there in that article. Going back to the paraphernalia, of course, we can make all kinds of ties to the sort of banality of evil of this regime in reading the sort of gray literature of these companies that are involved in the incarceration regime. This is a GIF in one of the annual reports of Southwest Key that actually tries to convince its stakeholders that they are all about diversity and inclusion. 95% of people of color served. Of course, what they don't mention is that this is 95% of people incarcerated, which I think this means says so much about America right now that I can't even begin to deconstruct it. Accompanying our own self-reflection, we invited experts outside of the team project to provide their own reflections. So we have scholars who work on these issues, each who wrote a reflection of 2 to 3 pages in a matter of 7 days. We also didn't just want to be negative. We created a map of allies, a directory that can help anybody who wants to get involved actually contact immigration lawyers and organizations and NGOs, etc. We produced a bibliography where we shared the data, and we made sure that everybody who participated and contributed in the project was credited equally. This is it. We did this, of course, in English, Spanish, and French. And after we were done with this in 7 days, we got to work right away on volume 2. Now, I'm not gonna go through everything in volume 2 because I wanna move along. But it is exactly the same structure. And instead of following the incarceration regime, in volume 2, we followed the money. Blue, in this case, is Democratic county districts, counties. And green is Republican. As you can see, of course, this is not a Republican or Democrat divide, despite what we tell ourselves on social media. In this, I want to conclude with one last visualization. By the way, this is also not a Trump-only phenomenon. Of course, Obama lays the foundation for this infrastructure. Of course, it grows under Trump. Each of these circles represents a company that contracts with the government to provide services for this infrastructure. I will conclude with one visualization in particular, the ice tray that represents these companies by categories, just to reinforce the point about the role of that the humanities plays and the humanities education and expertise plays in the making of these things. The data we were working on for volume 2 mostly comes from usspending.gov. It's the annual report that the government puts out on all its contracts. The categories that are used in that data set to describe industries comes from the NAFTA agreement. So industries are described from a business perspective. Now what we did is we went through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rows and recategorized everything, each single company from the perspective of a humanist. How we can understand these things. This is how we end up with the category surveillance, which I guarantee you is not a category in the NAFTA agreement. Now this is, of course, for me, one of the visualizations that actually gives you a sense of the poetics of the whole thing. In a sense, what we have done here as scholars and scholar activists is to look back. If we are being surveilled, then perhaps as scholars, something we can do, one of the things we can do, is to see them. They see us, we see them. To document, in a sense, takes me into the second movement of my comments today, which is, what is this? In a sense, for me, the first thing this is an instrument of contemporary history. What we have done is actually documented the now. And this is perhaps one of the best things we can do, because we're trained to do it. I don't claim to be an immigration lawyer. I can show up to a protest just like you can. There's no special skills involved in that. But using my skills as a book historian, working with others who have been trained similarly, perhaps one of the things we can do as the world burns is to document it. And document it in such a way that actually perhaps prompts action without being too specific about what that action is, since that is not our job. I'm also not a politician. So, what are some of the other things that this has been understood as? This has been understood as library science. I can see it. I'm a librarian myself. I am not a fancy professor like some of our esteemed colleagues here. I am a digital scholarship librarian. Of course, library science always comes to mind whenever you catalog things, whenever you organize things into little buckets, which we have done here. So maybe that's what it is. Our journalist friends thinks we are meta-journalists. They recommended us as a tool for journalists. So they say, we are working in the interest of journalists. And it is true that about 20 different journalists use this project to actually pursue stories and go down the rabbit hole of the sort of distant view that we had made. Where is it? Somewhere around here. I'm not gonna look for it. It's in this article where it's like people doing things to help journalists. Some people themselves thought we were journalists ourselves. We are not. Not a single person in this team was actually trained in journalism. But actually getting called a data journalist over and over again actually prompted some really important reflections for me. Basically summarized as perhaps we could be in the business of helping out our journalist friends. At a time in which journalists seem to be they're getting better at it now than what we thought they were doing last year, of dealing with constant dumpster fires, left and right. A sort of strategy that's coming out of the White House that is distraction. And they didn't know or they didn't seem like they knew how to handle that last year. I think they're doing a little better today. But also help them because their actual data teams and mapping teams that they have are not that many. People employed as professionals in data science in mainstream journals it's a small group, it's a small demographic. I think New York Times has a great team. Washington Post has a great team, etc. But you start counting them and you won't reach more than 10. And this is where perhaps those of us in the room who work on GIS, who work on data analysis and data visualization, perhaps we can step in and help out sometimes. And the third reflection that this prompted, getting called a data journalist, was that, of course, we are different than them in the sense that we're not bound up by the two sides to every story. We're scholars. Our job is to actually be empirical, to be honest. We don't have to frame our stories in this, well, but they think this, but we think that. In fact, what happened when the Salem Daily covered this project in an interview with Rupik Rism, they felt they need to balance out what she was saying about helping out with the kids being separated from the families by inviting somebody who believed that it was okay to separate kids from the families. And this is what you get. They literally put a white nationalist in the paper in order to balance anybody trying to help these kids. We are not bound by that. Okay, so moving into the final movement, the third movement. If this can be these many things, and perhaps, of course, it sounds weird for me to say that, oh, this is a great project. I have to wait for you to say it. Let's say that we want to do things like this. And yet for academics and the public in general, it's hard to recognize what kind of thing it is. It is a genre that still has not coagulated around a name. We're moving into tricky labor territory because how do we write this for a tenure and promotion file, in a tenure and promotion file? As a librarian, how do I write this on my annual report, since my role in here was not to help scholars, which is what librarians get paid to. And every time I help you, it's like, great, more money. But when I do things that are my own initiative, that is very ambiguous how that plays out in my promotion. What about a student who is writing a dissertation? Those of us who try to guide graduate workers / students into a career are irresponsible every time we say, yeah, of course you have time to do this other extra stuff. And at the same time, we have graduate students working here in this project. How do we make what they did here legible? I don't have the answers to these questions, but I do know a little bit about the structural problem, even outside of institutions, that perhaps creates the opening by which we may encourage this type of work. Now let me put it to you this way. Inside the university, we are encouraged to work in an interdisciplinary environment. And little by little, the university is learning how to reward that, but we still have to wait a long time for that. Outside the university, we are encouraged to work in interdisciplinary projects if there's a grant. That is actually quite legible. You got a grant, I think most people can get a little institutional candy for being in a grant. What we don't have is incentives to work interdisciplinary outside the university without a grant. Now here's the problem with working interdisciplinary inside your institution without a grant that's weird. We kind of don't necessarily fit with the people that get hired by our own institution. We don't have the right team necessarily to do X or to do Y within our own institutions. So the institutions hire us to try to take care of large amounts of needs within one domain. And then it's hard to click, or relatively hard. We do it all the time. We find colleagues in our own institutions that are great to work with on specific projects. But the institution is not designed for that necessarily. the right people that we can put together to work on these kinds of projects usually are outside of our institutions, and we know them in conferences, and we are of the same cohort or of the same subdisciplines, etc. And we know that if we had the ability to work with them on these kinds of things, we could do magic. Now, of course, not without a grant. And this is where this kind of project becomes impossible, because this was done in 7 days. And we know that this is the type of project that could have gotten a grant, except it would have taken us a year to put together the grant. So obviously we can't be waiting. In fact, because we didn't have to deal with the bureaucracy in order to do this, I mean, it was during the summer. People took time away from writing their books. I took time. I wiggled some vacation room with some like, I don't think I'm feeling well today. We were able to focus on this. This, by the way, let me reiterate. This is not a platform. This is software we built. Not a single one of us studied computer science or data science or anything. These are PhDs in English and history, building original software with original data, with scholarship attached to it, in 7 days. This is, in terms of a digital humanities project, this is the equivalent of a $500,000 grant from Mellon, in 7 days for free. Why? We found the perfect team. We didn't have to deal with the bureaucracy of our own institution and the bureaucracy of the grant institutions. Now, I don't know how we're going to do this. But if we figure out how to work with the right teams outside of our institution, with some of them, I mean, me and Manan are working inside the same institution, but we have the experience together that allows us to work on a team like this. If we're allowed to form teams to work outside grant funding structures, in a way that actually is rewarded by our institutions in our tenure and promotion packages, perhaps as part of our dissertation, etc., perhaps we will see more of these projects, if we want to do them. Now, I don't want to end up on that note, oh, we'll never have nice things. After we did this project, we've had many people who never thought of doing mapping or doing data science, who were using off-the-shelf tools. As many students, undergraduates and graduate students, who just felt inspired to just go do something. And one of the best maps that was circulating on social media last year was a map of abortion laws in the United States. That was done using Tableau by a student who was in sabbatical in Argentina. And because she had seen this project, she didn't need any fancy anything, and she did it. So I want to end with that note. I want to end with the note that was not for the 30 minutes or so. That was like, I have 2 minutes. I want to end with that note. And the note is that we took a risk and just stopping what we were doing to do something that's politically charged and could have repercussions for us. And I wanna be supportive of those who take those risks. I mean, you can be prudent and never do any one of these things. And I will support you too, because I understand. I have a family, people have debt, and all these kind of things. At the same time, I want to make sure that people understand that me, and I know many others like me, support those of you who want to take those kinds of risks, work outside of those reward infrastructures. And perhaps you don't do something as complicated as this. You do something simpler. But you're doing it, and that's what matters. I think at this particular juncture in the history of the United States and in the history of the world, I think scholars have an opportunity to reimagine ourselves in a way that we contribute to the crises to come, and to do so using our own skills. Again, to reemphasize the point, of course we can show up at the march, of course we can fill the petition, of course we can vote. We can do all these things that academic activists have been doing forever. But in this particular model, what I encourage you to do is to do what to do what you were trained to do, and use that as an intervention into the mess that we're in. Thank you.
Thank you, that was fantastic. I know that there will be questions from the audience, so I would invite you to. And I think there's a, someone back here, there's a,
Yeah, there's one.
one back there.
Do you want a mic? You should.
No, she's got one, one's coming over to her. Great.
Thanks. Thank you. I mean, just first of all, thank you for this amazing project. I saw it when it came out. I am so grateful for it, and it's wonderful to hear you talk about it in detail and kind of hear about the process of it. So just super appreciation. Secondly, I was thinking about, so I've been teaching data journalism for the past 5 years. And I think it's really interesting to hear your reflections about, like, is this data journalism? Well, we're not data journalists. So I think I wanted to just say two things and see what you thought. So first of all, the thing that I talk about in terms of the false equivalency, you know, like, so this is an older model, and one point that I want to make in journalism schools is that journalistic norms are changing right now because of the information climate is changing. So like, in an older model of journalism where there was like some sort of shared agreement about what the truth is, you can do this like, oh, let's interview people on both sides. But there is critical conversation going on about like, how do journalistic norms need to shift when we have things like climate change and blatant lies, and like you don't go get blatant lies and put those in the truth. So like, there is a big conversation in journalism right now about misinformation. So just to say that that's like a thing, and that's shifting for journalists.
That's good to hear.
Yes.
No, and it is starting to be visible, the change between the last year and this year, in even in mainstream venues like the New York Times. Like the New York Times is starting to get what we would have called editorial.
Yes.
In the main section. I don't know if you noticed this, and it was like, this is one way to combat misinformation, is to like, no. But seen from the eyes of the editorial, seen from the eyes of the old one.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think there's still people who would cling to this idea that journalism can or should be objective, but increasingly, at least where I was teaching, we are moving more toward like a civic media conception of journalism and community engaged media, and these are still tensions, so it's not like we're all in agreement about this, but I do think there's some shift there. And then just the other thing I would say, like, and think about these sort of who came out as a result of this map in terms of like the data journalists and the stories and this kind of thing, like, I guess I wonder, do you see any potential future vision of alliances of solidarity amongst scholars and humanists, journalists, librarians, as part of like what I would call a civic information infrastructure, which with each of those groups that are being very threatened. Like, you know, journalism has lost 40% of its jobs since 2000. Humanities are very much underfunded. I don't know what the librarians are happening right now, but there's probably funding crises as well. So
We're fine because we help people.
Are there potential?
We just say we're here to help, and that apparently seems to be working. It probably won't.
But so do you see like visions of solidarity amongst those groups, or?
Yes, I do. We were on the phone with Washington Post and ProPublica, etc. And we were trying to convince ProPublica not to give the precise information of this when this was happening. With Washington Post, we were trying to improve their data because they came out 4 days. We came out 7 days after. They came out 4 days after with their own visualization, and we saw all kinds of gaps. So we got on the phone with them and send them our data. And this is why I made one of the points the point that I wanted you to take home at the end about like using our skills. Our skills are the capacity to do deep research. So in a sense, we have a lot more in common with long-form journalists or investigative journalists. Like we spend even more time than they do investigating X or investigating Y, right? And a lot of that time is checking the literature against each other, checking the scholarly record as it is against our own ideas and the kind of new research that we're bringing to life. And I think that's a very valuable skill that can be a part of this. The other thing we're decent at is at least opinions vary, but with telling stories and crafting good rhetoric. Because we study it, at least us in the English department, we study rhetoric and we study how we perform arguments and we know then how to perform our own. So this might be something that we're bringing to the table too. Obviously, journalists also practice these arts. The other thing we are getting decent at because of digital humanities is actually thinking about how this research can be communicated in sort of these architectures of knowledge that we're creating. Sometimes maps, sometimes visualization, sometimes digital archives and exhibits, multimedia, narratives, all kinds of experimental genres coming out of digital humanities actually can play a role here, I think. I think a lot of great experimental data journalism. And I don't remember, I was talking to Ken Work, which is I think he's called about this several months ago, where it's like, I don't know if anybody noticed that actually data visualization started making it into opinion pieces. When did that start happening? That was like 2 years ago. That is a kind of twist on the opinion piece. We did not expect that, right? This is this moment of genre transformation that we're all experiencing, that I tried to focus on that second movement, that I also think we are poised to help understand. Because at least those in English, we have studied genre. We are really good at studying genre and its history, and how these genres kind of play out in the public sphere. So the answer is yes. How are we going to go about it? Because of the reward, we don't have the same reward mechanisms. Even to work with civic, with community engagement. Like I know that you guys are involved in a community engagement project here at Columbia. It's a little difficult that there's this eminent domain fight right now between Columbia and the communities that they would say in the press that they care about. This is being filmed, I'm so funny.
Thank you so much for your talk. A point that really resonated with me is how you said that disciplines are now being reimagined and reinterpreted, such as library science, even English. And I'm a trained literary historian of the 18th and 19th century. I do a lot of deep archival work. And so I've developed a digital project. And so I'm thinking about, the larger question I have is how do we quantify this? And this is the point that you brought up.
How do we what?
How do you quantify our digital humanities projects, or how do we talk about them in terms of our merit, in terms of our faculty merit evaluations at the end of the year that we submit? And so I'm thinking about it, like my entree into digital humanities mapping work, and knowing that this project grows out of a book project, and then thinking about how, whether there are best practices that digital humanists are pushing forward to institutions to show how they quantify the digital work that people in traditional disciplines are now doing. Because even in my department, or even in my institution where there isn't a large digital humanities institute or presence like at Fordham or at Columbia, and individual professors are doing their own individual work, when there isn't a visible institute at your university, how do you negotiate that with the provost or the dean to show that you're working on a digital project that's not largely understood among the old guard in your own department? You know, like, and so I know that, you know, at Fordham, at Columbia, maybe that doesn't happen, but when you're at other universities where there aren't big digital centers, then I'm wondering if some of the leading practitioners in the field, such as yourself, are thinking about writing or publishing like best practices that could be published and forwarded to like major people like deans and provosts, so they understand that this is an actual discipline that people are looking at.
What university are you in?
University of Kentucky. And I know that the geography department is great digital mapping. And I know people in the geography department, but there isn't like a large institute or a big presence at the university?
So this is going to vary by institution by institution. There are guidelines, MLA, HA, the major professional organizations have already created these documents for deans and provosts, working with large teams of digital humanists. The needle has not moved very much. My only recommendation, at Columbia or Kentucky, my only recommendation is to put it at the end of your tenure and promotion file on a footnote. Right now, to be honest. There are people who've been fighting, the people who trained me in digital humanities, Bethany Novinsky of the University of Virginia. She comes from a generation, a cohort that actually was fighting this fight, who were trained by people that came from a cohort that was fighting that fight. We're three cohorts in fighting that fight without having moved a needle. So that actually is even like, forget digital humanities, I'm trying to do mobilized humanities. And like, that's like, it does give you the sense of impending doom, that good, important work of a certain kind. It's not like the one that does get rewarded necessarily is not important. We can do amazing work within the strictures of the university. It's just that I know that this particular kind of work is participating in this economy that does not seem to have that much hope of changing. As a person, I recommend footnote at the end. Write 2 books and keep on writing. That's what everybody, all the faculty in our lab do. They have done. They have written 2 books. They have published all the essays, showed up at the course, they did everything. And at the end, oh, and I used to participate a little bit in this lab. Yeah.
I hear you and I agree. I don't know, I don't need it. Okay. I struggled with this a lot myself as a community-based participatory action researcher, where we're always prioritizing the kinds of products we create with communities first before the publication, and all that work takes so long and everything. But and now I'm at Pratt, an architecture design school, so they love this kind of work. But when I was at University of Utah, probably at Kentucky, we literally had the count sheet where it was work, even that if you did editorial work, that didn't count. Anyways, but how the work got valued was in the frame of public scholarship. And so actually, I know it's probably really different at Columbia, I think, but I felt like it wasn't about the footnote. It was about trying to make a case for, and in my review packages and everything around public scholarship, and because the universities like Columbia that actually is dispossessing their neighbors, or in a lot, and no, but it's not just Columbia. Pratt's doing that too, right? And all of these schools have these histories of violences towards their communities and exclusion. That in a way, I think they literally all the work that we did was one of, and this was another contradiction, but one of the kind of public faces of what the university wanted to say, look, we're doing this work. Mm-hmm. We're like, oh, we're the poster child for the kind of community mission, whatever that they're trying to, that they're also right, so that kind of, so we're in that contradictory position. We're like, oh, maybe we should not at all have our university affiliation because we don't really want to be part of that. But I'm just saying, I do think the public scholarship can be part of how you also present your work. And I just feel also want to just say thank you so much for your talk and your incredible work. And I feel like one of the pieces that I feel like I'm learning from you is the way that you partner with journalists, because that's something that is a way of getting your work out to the public. And I think that's the thing that, the interdisciplinarity and thinking about what are all the skills and who's on our team that can help us to get our work to different audiences who are both, I could see your work being part of the work that we would write about in our work on immigration issues with undocumented students in Utah, for example, right? Because that's part of the structural for the, so you could be publishing on that work, but then someone's putting it out there in the press. So all of those ways of really thinking about that, I think a lot of scholars don't think about, right? They're focused on their book, but what are the alliances that we need to make, kind of along the lines of what you were saying, to get the work out to a broader public. And you did such an incredible job of doing that so quickly And that's been one of our struggles with some of our work, is how do we get it out to the right places? How do we, so I would love to hear, like, you talk a little bit more about that, about those kinds of strategic alliances and how these public products live, right? Because I think websites, it's like part of the challenge is how do you get people there, right? You can build this incredible archive, but all of those kinds of things.
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, of course. Even we can go down to the level of practical tips if you want. In fact, let's do that right away. While you're doing this is something that's a bad habit. I mean, the pros and cons of digital humanists who, while they're doing a project, they tweet about the process in medias res. And then that has the chance of catching the attention of the press, right? It helps if you follow a lot of journalists and interact with their tweets, and once in a while retweet a journal, so that, have a beer with journalists once in a while, be a part of their world. And the thing is that if within your networks you are participating in the community of journalists and you're doing something that they know will be of interest to the public, then you have an opportunity to work with them as you're doing the project. This is the case of what happened when we were doing the Puerto Rico Mapathon. New York Times knew that we organized this one in 7 days too. After Maria, this Columbia Libraries, this is my space that's do here. At Columbia Libraries, after Maria, we had one of these conversations. Are we going to do something? And it was like, yes, we are. Let's do it. So we followed the model that was used for the Nepal earthquake, where we used the tools of OpenStreetMap for crowdsourcing maps. We organized in 7 days a workshop at Columbia, but we didn't stop there. Now, one of the things that we do, we started talking about it since day one that we decided to work on it. We started talking on social media about how we wanted other universities to do it, because we knew that even if we could attract 100 or 200 people at Columbia to work on the map, that wasn't going to really have so much of an impact. But we knew that if enough universities and digital humanities centers, mostly are the people that we talked to, could step in, then we probably could have a dent on the map. Mm-hmm. So while we were having this conversation, me and I'm passing around the model of how to organize these things, super practical stuff like make sure you have a poster, make sure you reserve a room, and I laid it down for people, like talk to your administrators and get the communications office of your institution to get involved, and this kind of things. All, by the way, you mentioned the Nimble Tents project, which is around here somewhere. What tab is that? Oh, there it is. Yeah. So all of this, both how we did Torn Apart and how we did the Relief Mapathon, and how we've done and how others have done a couple of these rapid things, is laid out here. So we had this being circulated. We had this kind of instruction manual on how to do this circulating. Then the journalists noticed that we were doing this, because they saw also that several universities, I think Boston, Miami, a couple of others, jumped in right away with us too, and were organizing just as fast as we were. So they saw that this was about to become a thing, and they picked up. Now, eventually, good news. Eventually, we did get 25 universities in the United States to actually participate in this, using this, and we rebuilt the whole map of Puerto Rico, which is now, after the Red Cross did their work, I'm guessing is benefiting Uber over there. But that's the trick. The trick is to be transparent as you're doing this. Be a part of the journalist community as much as you can, so that when you're doing this. And 3, I think it bears mentioning, working with your communications office in your institution is not a bad idea. They'll be there for you sometimes. Depends. They have direct line to the president and to the provost, so it will be something that depends. Like ours at Columbia was super happy with volume 1 of Torn Apart. And when we did volume 2, following the money, they're like not answering our emails. So yeah, incarceration bad. Ooh, money, investments, not.
So, great. So I think we have time for one more question, because I know that coffee's waiting. Tierney, would you like to?
So my question is about libraries. Like, I really enjoyed how you brought up sort of how libraries and librarians are seen as helpers, which I think is true. We're a helping profession, but sometimes then we're not seen as like full collaborators and partners. And you know, people have ideas and stuff. So it's great to see a project on this scale and of this importance led by librarians. So I guess I'm wondering, how is this idea of Mobilized Humanities sort of thought about in your institution at Columbia, and whether or not there was like a lot of resonance and buy-in with librarians outside the Digital Scholarship Center? Because I think there's a lot of roles here for like reference, technical services, all of this other stuff. So I'm curious.
So we during for the Mapathon one, we were working with all kinds of librarians who stepped in and helped. I guess it depends on the project. For this one, we had to put a very small team so that we could do what we did. You needed to be for those of you who are not in the libraries, here's what happens in the library when you mention a project. You should talk to the subject specialist for that project, and the metadata specialist, and then I can only meet in 2 weeks from now, and then 3 weeks from now you're meeting with the other specialist and the other union, because it's about library cohesion and how we should all be working with each other. Librarians are also very territorial, so it's like, that's my subject. Why are you, or my favorite, that's my faculty. Like we own faculty. I don't know if you knew that. So obviously for this one, if you wanted to be mobilized, not eventually mobilized, then I had to kind of not do that. And I think you have to navigate it carefully within the library. I have made myself a red-headed stepchild over the 7 years I worked at Columbia Libraries for sort of things I do and say. Going back to how you started asking that question, service, as I said, is a double-edged sword. It seems to be protecting us on the labor market, both because the library is more of a corporate model with a very strict hierarchy that seems to please the president and the provost, as opposed to faculty rebels, so democratic, whatever, and faculty senate. We're just like, we have a boss who has a boss who has a boss, and we'll just do what we're told. That seems to be greed. And there's a chance that actually that's where scholarship will move into this corporate model that librarians will be super comfortable with. And of course, the other side of that sword is that we have to continue to say we're just here to help, and we're providing a service. And we're not the main person. We're not Neil Armstrong. We're the engineers in the base. And that, of course, actually rubs some people the wrong way. It's like, I want to feel important. I want to feel like I'm doing something. So I don't know, that's something else we have to negotiate. And I want to end on one note, which is going back to your question, which is that this is not even the main problem for us right now. In the profession, both in the schools and in the library, right now people of color are fighting with one hand behind their backs. And we have to work 3 times what our colleagues are working in order to actually get it. So most of the people in our lab are immigrants. That's something that is, most of the moderators in our lab are immigrants from all over the place, from all over the planet. Something that gets missed in some of these conversations. And most of us are actually trying to do triple just so that we can survive. I'm not even talking about promotion. Forget promotion. We just want to get fired. I have 2 kids. So in that sense, I don't want us to lose sight on the things that are really the structural problems here that are even higher than, like, can I get digital humanities acknowledged, or how am I going to negotiating the library? I mean, my biggest challenge at the library is not being white. So, anyways.
Great. Well, on that note. Thank you so much for coming here today. It's just been eye-opening on so many fronts for all of us. And I'm sure that you will be able to continue the conversation over coffee, which is ready in the back of the room. We will rejoin here.
Yeah, we're running a little late for the first time. Well, we have a built-in cushion for lunch, so let's take about 5 to 10 minutes, bathroom break, coffee break, and then come right back. Thank you so much.
Really great. We're great. So great. So great. Thanks. I turned it off. Okay.